Hi, good evening, Mr. Mehrotra. Thanks so much for joining me for this interview. For those of you who are watching this interview and may not be aware of the great work that Mr. Mehrotra does, he is the chair of urban design and planning at Harvard. And he has been the executive director of Urban Design Research Institute in Mumbai. And now he's the trustee. And at the same time, he has co-authored and authored many books. And it's really an honor to be interviewing you, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So shoot your first question.
So my first question, sir, is where were you born and educated? And what inspired you to be an architect and embark on this journey?
I was born in New Delhi, grew up in Mumbai. And I suppose growing up in Mumbai and seeing the city change all the time, and also having parents who moved homes quite frequently, I think I just got interested in the way space makes an impact on our lives, and got interested in just seeing how one responded differently to it. And through good mentorship, talking to people, one realized that one way of kind of realizing that interest is to study architecture.
And what key life experiences or jobs have formed who you are today and brought you at this level?
I think one has to do with a lot of traveling. I think you learn a lot traveling, especially if you're an architect and if you're interested in cities, because I think it's through the experience, through learning how to observe, to seeing differences, seeing different ways space is made, seeing different responses you have to that space. I think for architects, travel makes a big difference, and it's ironic saying this in this time of pandemic where we travel through the kind of backgrounds I'm seeing on your video, and that might be the virtual experience, which is also, I think, important. I think travel was one very significant part of at least my learning and development. If I look back in retrospect, and I think I was fortunate that even my parents traveled a lot when we were growing up, and so the travel bug was always omnipresent, which one continued through one's education as an architect and ever after. And I really look back and think that really taught me a great deal.
And how did you become passionate and involved in the city of Mumbai? As I see you've done incredible work there.
I grew up in Mumbai between 1970 and I studied architecture starting 1976. So those were 6 or 7 formative years in school. Then one went to architecture school. So one kind of knew the city for those 6, 7 years, a little longer, maybe 8 years before going to study architecture. And then going to study architecture and coming back, one saw the city in a completely different way because one could understand, rationalize, articulate what changes one deciphered, why that happened, the dislocations. One was equipped as a professional to do that, right? And so, and then I studied urban design after that, which equipped me even more, but it took me away from my city. So I think knowing a city, going away, getting new lenses, coming back to the city, suddenly made me see aspects of the city, aspects of the city's evolution, aspects of understanding why the form of the city was because of certain circumstances, whether they were political, economic, social. In the case of Mumbai, it suddenly made me understand how there was a correlation between the patterns of reclamation and the kind of urban design that came up in different parts. And it coincided with a particular time period where there were popularities of style. And so suddenly one started deciphering the city. And once you begin to do that, you kind of get engaged with the city in a different way. And as I say, the better you know a place, but the better you know a situation, the better you know a site, it makes your interventions much more effective. So then you know exactly what is the space for intervention. And that's very important. And once you can kind of see that correlation, then I think the passion just sort of comes.
And also, do you think Mumbai is a great city? And why do you think it is or it is not?
Well, it is, I mean, it's a great city for many reasons. It's a great city because it's a great social condenser. You have people from all walks of life, some diversity, cultural diversity, economic diversity, that all can kind of coexist and in a synergistic way. It's also a great city because it has an amazing history, a genetic code that has evolved it in a particular way. It is Now there's a book that's called City of Gold, where, I mean, the metaphor is that the sidewalks are paved with gold, which is to say that anyone can come there and survive. You could say that of New York. You can say that of most great cities. But I mean, I think the big difference, because you've used the word great, and here I quote Charles Correa, who called Mumbai a great city, but a terrible place. And you have to differentiate these two. So it's a great city in the energy that it brings, the kind of bright lights that it attracts migrants and young people because of Bollywood, because of other things. But it's a terrible place, as he described, because as a physical plant, it is deteriorating every day. It doesn't have the amenities, the sanitation, the access to water, the access to housing. So it's a great city, but it's a terrible place. And I think really, finally, we have to aspire as architects to make great places and great cities. So great cities that are also great places. And there are many examples, many things that have flashed in the screen in your background are great cities and great places too. Mumbai, unfortunately, is not yet a great place.
Yes, and since it's struggling so much right now during this pandemic, I hope some new interventions will be made which will help it
Well,
evolve towards a great
that's a
city.
very good point, because if you look at the history of Mumbai, great disasters have spurred major transformational changes. So the first one was in the early 1800s, where there was a great fire that made people realize they were living in very high dense areas in the fortifications. So they opened the fort walls, they expanded the city, they put infrastructure. So with every such move, or major disaster, we had the Great Plague, which again people realized that there was densities that they couldn't deal with. Open space became important, and so there was a big emphasis paid to that in the restructuring of the city. And really, the pandemic is a moment where I think globally, forget Mumbai, I think all cities have to be introspective, and some cities will respond and be able to retrofit themselves much more easily or not have to do anything. But other cities would have to take it seriously. And I think in the case of Mumbai, the two things that it will have to take extremely seriously. One is the question of housing, that is access of housing for people, because the house has suddenly become such a valuable commodity when we can, I mean, you and I are blessed that we can, from our very safe places and using virtual technology, have a conversation like this, correct? But most people on this planet don't have that luxury, or even, let's say, the basic amenity, forget luxury. And so I think in Mumbai, post-pandemic, they'd have to take housing very seriously, housing that is adequate, that is affordable, that is located in good relationships with livelihood and amenities. And they'd have to take the idea of public space, and especially open space and especially green space, much more seriously, where people can meet and be distanced even in a condition like the pandemic, but that there is a much more equitable distribution between the number of people that live in that physical plant and the kind of access and proportionate access they have to public and especially open green spaces.
Okay, so my next question is what causes, projects, and activities are you currently involved in, and why do you tend to work towards them?
I mean, projects, one is involved in many projects you work on because you have clients who come to you and give you assignments, and it keeps your studio going. And you hope that they're good assignments and you can do them well. But I don't want to go into that. Uh, I mean, what I'm currently working on is a project which is looking at urbanization in India. It's a project one has been thinking about for a long time. For me, it becomes even more important now because of the pandemic, because of what happened with the reverse migration, the number of people that got dislocated, where are they going, and the idea that small towns might begin to grow. And so therefore, I'm very interested in seeing what is the relationship of the larger national territory, and where are people locating, what might be patterns of urbanization, how could you network these, how could we create disaggregated networks. So we don't want to go into the American suburban model, which is what people did to flee the World War and paranoia. The car propelled it, and you landed up having incredibly unsustainable urban development and urban form. And so in India, could we think of the multitude of small towns we have and network them, but actually make investments in those places? So that will stop people coming from the big cities. It'll create a much more dispersed urbanization. It'll create places where land is not as contested, because when land gets very contested, you have high prices, which means you price out most of the population. And so therefore, I think India desperately needs a balanced urbanism. It needs an urbanism which, is mindful of the hinterland of the big cities, and it's not focused just on the big cities. As I believe, we have paid too much attention to the big cities, and that's part of the reason we are in the problem we are.
And sir, how do you collaborate with other groups and individuals to realize your impactful work that you've done um, throughout your career?
Well, I mean, I think the best collaborations come from defining the problem in terms which makes everybody equal, because otherwise, if one discipline or one collaborator has the privilege in terms of the decision making or access to certain kinds of knowledge, you have very imbalanced collaborations. Those are at best symbolic, right? So the question is, when you have a problem, how do you define it? And define it in a way that whoever you're going to collaborate with feels they have an equal bearing, ownership, and equal contribution to make to the problem, right? And so the thing is, sometimes you don't need to collaborate because you feel you can pull it off on your own. And as the problems get more complex, I think we have to, as architects, understand that we can't take an arrogant position where we can lead the way on many domains and many aspects, but we have to depend on people. And therefore, the definition of the terms of the problem become very important as a starting point.
What other creators who are focused on similar causes, projects, and activities have influenced you so far?
That's a difficult question, and there's no single person. For different things different people have, and I don't know, that's a hard one to answer. I think, there have been teachers who have been very influential, and they're influential in a different way, and then the architects who've been influential, and they've been influential in a different way. Some who worked on cities, some who worked on buildings, some who worked on both. So that's an answer a question I always find very hard to answer, because I don't want to bring it down to one or even two or even five people, because the influences are much more. It's the same way when people ask you, what is your favorite building? I mean, that's like a hard question to answer. Or who's your favorite architect? It's a hard question to answer. I would say just many people.
Fair enough. But sir, we've seen that you've been so closely associated with Charles Correa, sir, also, and a lot of us take inspiration from him. So could you share like some insights from his philosophy how he went about seeking inspiration, or one of his projects that probably inspire you?
I mean, I think he took his training as a modernist and managed to root it very much to the context he worked in. And he managed very much um, to abstract the learnings from the context of India and write about it, and in a sense, construct a theory. And so whether his early articles on form follows climate, which was, I think, very seminal, because around the world they were talking about form follows function, and he said form follows climate. And it was a very seminal essay for me, and it really opened up for me looking at architecture in a different way. I think one also takes inspiration from someone like that. So one is, I think he perhaps is the only architect of that generation who could frame theory, because he had the facility to write and think analytically, and not in a way of a kind of touchy-feely way, in a kind of emotional way, which architects tend to do. Lots of words fly in the air, but he could make a very precise argument, whether it was housing and using the metrics of density, actually making a point that is useful for a younger architect to take forward. And similarly, I think his writings on climate responses, on his whole theory about New Bombay, what you see in the book New Landscape, I think he was someone from that generation who offered us that theoretical frame. I don't see that very much in many other architects of his generation. So that was one. The other was, I think, the ability to work both top down and bottom up. He could work, in organizing things, getting things done at the site scale of the site, but he could also be appointed by Rajiv Gandhi to write the National Commission on Urbanization. So that's a kind of top-down, or to set up CITCO and New Bombay and have a city for 3 million people and have the government on his side and, fight those kinds of causes. And I think that is very inspirational because I think architects either we get stuck at one end of that spectrum, but I mean I think that's worth thinking very hard about how we can move across the spectrum, because then we can connect with the grassroots through the through the bottom up kinds of endeavors to feel the pulse, to intervene at the site, to execute buildings, even at the smallest scale, to think about housing, but at the same time have the ability to negotiate with these more powerful forces, which is the government, which is politicians, which is people who can call the shots, and often we are marginalized from those discussions. And I mean, I think he was perhaps again the only one of his generation who actually had that voice in society so broadly, whether it was forming public opinion or it was actually negotiating with governments and sitting on commissions and trying to change the rules, setting up a whole new city, and the protocols for it, taking on the whole milllands cause, taking the developers to court, and fighting it up to the Supreme Court. I mean, not many architects do that kind of thing.
Great. Thanks for sharing that insight, sir. And my last question would be, what would you recommend someone like me who wants to become a future creator of great cities, or others who are going to watch this interview?
Well, go to that, whatever you think is a great city, go there, live there on the ground. And, you have to work on the ground. And I mean, I think the way to do that, and the way I kind of talk to my students about this, is that you have to find a way that your spheres of concern, which is all the values you bring, things you want to do, you find a way that you can actually create a sphere of influence. That is, you can create an agency. And so therefore it's very important to be critical, to think about uh, these issues in a systematic way and try to understand what is the right scale, what is the right moment, what is the right agency that you should get in a city. So, and that you can only do by living in the city, and understanding how it operates and where you might be most useful, where you can really intervene. Yeah. So that's one. The second is, don't wait for people to come to ask you to solve problems. Solve those problems and then convince people those were problems and this is the solution. So in a sense, architects have to get ahead of the curve, not stay behind the curve. As I've said, planning, and I've written about this, planning in places like India, South Asia, has become rearguard action. We are coming into plan after the problems has already been created. So we have to get into a kind of avant-garde mode where we have to actually speculate, not speculate in a real estate way, but speculate about what might be better possibilities that society can organize themselves spatially. I mean, society has invested in us a lot of money to train us to imagine spatial possibilities in ways we organize ourselves, whether it's how a housing unit can be reorganized to how a city can be reorganized. And that is our biggest calling and our biggest responsibility to society. So we shouldn't forget that. And therefore, we have to find ways that we can fulfill that calling. We can't wait for society to call on us. We have to call on society.
Agree. Thanks. So, but one last question, apart from my academic interview, I think, which I would like to know is, since you researched so intricately around Ganga, what do you think is the solution to the problem of this pollution?
Oh, I mean, I think one has to think much more ecologically across the whole territory. This cannot be sliced by, I mean, it's like gerrymandering here for politicians. You can't slice this by political boundaries. There is a natural boundary that one has to discern. Unfortunately, whether it's agencies, whether it's oversight, it's all happening by political, administrative constructions of boundaries, right? I mean, the Ganga is a continuous field, and therefore it has to be treated in that imagination as the Indo-Gangetic plain, and what is happening in the Indo-Gangetic plain all the way from the source of the water to where the water reaches. And I think that holistic thinking, I mean, the thinking exists, there's been literature, people have done work on it, but I think how you implement it is really the challenge, the implementation. And that I don't know what the solution for that is. They always say to plan is human, but to implement divine. And so you need a divine force to do that. And it can either happen uh, with, terrible disaster, which we don't want. And then human beings tend to react, as you can see what's happening with the pandemic. Or you know, you need people who have that leadership quality, and it can't just be a top-down kind of thing. Right now, what's happening in India, there's a lot of top-down gestures being made, but they're not taking any root on the ground. That's one. And I think the biggest question is for climate change, and I think that's the rubric within which you have to look at the Ganges, is that finally we have to have more equitable societies. We can't have the inequities that we have and expect nature to be repaired. Because why should the poor in the Amazon not cut the forest, right? Or why shouldn't the country nationally not cut those forests? I mean, why should they take the burden for the rest of the planet that has, really raped their own resources? So there's a kind of inequity politically and culturally and economically. I think we need to correct society first, because unless you have society in balance, you'll never get nature in balance. I think it's a larger philosophical question which has to be dealt with. One can think through how one can bring that to happen on the ground. But I don't know what the answer is. But it needs a combination, which means this is not a top-down solution. It's not a bottom-up solution. It's got to be both simultaneously, back and forth. And it's got to be set into a iterative motion where each learn from the other through feedback loops that are complex, that have to be open-ended, that have to be collaborative, and that have to have leadership both at the bottoms up and the top down. And I think civil society, which is all of us, experts, citizens groups, and NGOs and foundations and institutions, all have to make that bridge between the top down and the bottom up. Then you'll begin to solve the problem. And I think we tend to try to find a silver bullet. Like, if we do this, it'll solve the problem. If we clean that ghat, it'll solve the problem. It's much more complex.
Thanks for doing this interview, sir.